The mountain air of Asheville always grew sharp as the afternoon sun dipped behind the western ridges. At the highest point of the valley sat Pinerest, a sprawling estate built from dark slate and heavy timber that had overlooked the human town for more than a century. The townspeople rarely walked up the winding gravel path toward the iron gates, speaking only in hushed tones about the reclusive master who lived within its walls. They whispered that the master, a man named Cyrus, possessed hair as white as winter frost and skin that never caught the warmth of the sun, ruling the night side of the valley with quiet authority. Inside the grand house, however, the daily rhythms remained steady and practical, maintained by a small army of human staff who kept the hearths burning and the floors polished. Iris moved through the long corridors of the west wing with a heavy wooden bucket and a clean rag, her eyes focused on the dark baseboards that required her attention before the evening bells. She was 22 years old, built for practical labor, and had spent the last 4 years learning how to make herself invisible in a house filled with deep shadows and silent movements. Her day had begun at 5 o'clock in the morning, and her list of errands for the afternoon was long enough to require a swift walk down into the valley market before the shops closed their doors for the night. She needed 3 yards of plain gray wool for the winter uniforms, a bundle of beeswax candles from the local chandler, and a small tin of dried thyme for the kitchen cook. Adjusting the straps of her canvas basket, she stepped through the side exit and began her descent into the bustling streets of the town below, glad for the crisp wind against her face. The market square was crowded with farmers shifting their wooden crates and merchants calling out the final prices of the day beneath the canvas awnings. Iris navigated the cobblestone paths with the easy familiarity of someone who had walked these streets since childhood, keeping her chin down and her movements purposeful. The scent of roasted chestnuts, damp earth, and coal smoke filled the air, creating a thick haze under the golden afternoon light. She was just wrapping the gray wool in a sheet of brown paper when a sharp, raised voice cut through the general murmur of the crowd near the fabric boutique at the corner. A tall man in a fine velvet waistcoat was standing over an elderly woman who had tripped against a wooden display stand outside his doorway. A long bolt of pale blue silk had tumbled from the shelf, unrolling across the damp dirt of the street like a broken ribbon. The shopkeeper crossed his arms, his face flushed with annoyance, as he looked down at the woman who was struggling to find her footing on the uneven stones. The woman looked remarkably small beneath her worn woolen shawl, her silver hair spilling out from its pins as she tried to gather her balance against the rough timber wall. She did not cry out or argue, but her hands were trembling slightly as she attempted to pull the dark fabric of her skirt away from the muddy ground. Iris stopped in her tracks, watching the passers-by glance at the scene before quickly walking away to avoid trouble. Iris did not hesitate for more than a second before crossing the street with quick, steady strides, stepping directly into the space between the angry shopkeeper and the shaken woman. She dropped her heavy canvas basket to the ground and looked at the merchant with a calm, pleasant expression that carried no hint of anger or accusation. "Sir, I am truly sorry for the trouble," Iris said, her voice clear enough to carry over the sound of the nearby horses. "My grandmother struggles with her balance when the mountain paths turn cold, and I should have been holding her arm more closely." Before the man could reply, Iris knelt on the damp stones, gathered the pale silk with efficient movements, and rolled it back into a tight, clean cylinder. She set the fabric back onto the wooden display stand, patted it straight, and stood up to face the shopkeeper once more, with a polite nod. "The display does not seem to have suffered any damage," she added, keeping her tone light and helpful. "We appreciate your patience with her mistake." The merchant opened his mouth to complain, looked at the perfectly restored bolt of silk, and then glanced at the small crowd of townspeople who had stopped to watch the interaction. Realizing there was no further audience for his anger, he let out a short grunt, turned on his heel, and retreated into his shop, closing the heavy wooden door with a sharp click. Iris turned immediately to the elderly woman, who was still holding fast to the timber wall with both hands. "Are you hurt anywhere?" Iris asked softly, her voice losing its formal public tone and becoming gentle as she reached out to steady the woman's shoulder. The woman looked up, revealing a pair of surprisingly sharp gray eyes that seemed entirely out of place beneath her travel-worn appearance. "No, I am not injured," the woman replied, her voice remarkably calm and steady despite the fall. "Just a bit startled by the suddenness of the stones, I suppose." "Let us get away from the main street," Iris said, picking up her canvas basket with one hand and offering her other arm for support. "There is a small park with a stone fountain just 2 streets over, where the noise from the market does not reach." The elderly woman looked at Iris for a long moment, her gaze measuring the young maid's face with a quiet intensity that Iris could not quite understand. Then, with a slow nod, she placed her small hand on Iris's arm, and they began to walk away from the shop together, moving at a slow, deliberate pace that matched the older woman's careful steps. The small park near the edge of the town square was empty, except for a few birds gathering near the rim of the circular stone fountain. Clear water spilled from a central pipe, creating a steady, rhythmic sound that washed away the lingering tension of the busy market streets. Iris guided the older woman toward a weathered wooden bench beneath a large maple tree whose leaves had just begun to turn amber. "Sit here for a moment and rest your feet," Iris said, setting her heavy basket on the grass beside them. The woman lowered herself onto the bench with a grateful sigh, folding her hands neatly in her lap while her dark shawl slipped down past her elbow. Iris reached over and gently pulled the fabric back over the woman's shoulder, smoothing the rough wool without saying a word. "Thank you," the woman said, looking directly into Iris's eyes with a sincerity that felt grounded and real. Iris reached into her canvas basket and pulled out a small tin canteen filled with fresh water from the Pinerest well. The kitchen cook always insisted that anyone walking the mountain trails carry water to avoid the midday heat, and Iris was glad she had followed the advice. She uncapped the tin and held it out, watching the woman take a few slow, careful sips before handing it back with a small nod of appreciation. As the woman drew her hand away, Iris noticed a thin red scratch running across the pale skin of her wrist, likely caught on the sharp edge of the wooden display stand during her fall. "It is not deep, but we should clean the dirt from it before it becomes painful," Iris said, pulling a plain white cotton handkerchief from her apron pocket. She poured a small amount of water from the canteen onto the cloth and held out her hand expectantly. The elderly woman offered her wrist without a single word of protest, watching Iris wipe away the dark streaks of dirt with gentle, precise movements. "You handled that shopkeeper with a great deal of skill," the woman remarked, her gray eyes fixed on Iris's face. "Not many young people know how to turn a man's anger away so quickly without causing a larger scene. People like that are usually looking for a fight or an apology in front of a crowd," Iris explained, folding the soiled handkerchief and placing it back in her pocket. "If you give them a quiet way to step back without losing their pride, they will usually take it because it is easier than continuing the argument." "You speak as though you have had plenty of practice with difficult people," the woman noted, a faint smile touching the corners of her mouth. "I work as a maid in a very large household up on the ridge," Iris said simply. "You learn to resolve things quietly when the masters prefer silence." The afternoon sun was sinking lower now, casting long shadows across the stone plaza and turning the fountain water into a bright ribbon of gold. A light mountain breeze swept through the park, rustling the dry leaves on the ground and catching the loose strands of the woman's silver hair. Without the iron pins to hold it, the long hair kept falling forward across her face, causing her to brush it back with an impatient gesture of her hand. Iris looked down at her own attire and reached up to the back of her head, untying a long ribbon of deep blue silk that held her own hair in place. The ribbon was embroidered along the edges with a delicate pattern of silver leaves, a specific token given to the Pinerest staff once they completed their 4th year of reliable service. Iris knew the value of the ribbon, as it marked her transition from the heavy laundry tubs to the lighter duties of the main house corridors. "May I help you with that?" Iris asked, holding the blue silk out so the woman could see it. "It will hold much better than the loose pins until you return home." The woman looked at the embroidered pattern for a long moment, her expression shifting into something deep and unreadable, before she inclined her head in permission. Iris stepped behind the bench, gathered the thick silver hair with practiced hands, and tied the blue ribbon into a neat, secure bow at the nape of the woman's neck. The older woman raised her hand to touch the silk ribbon, her fingers tracing the silver embroidery with a careful, gentle touch. "What is your name, child?" she asked, turning her head slightly to look at Iris. "My name is Iris," the girl replied, adjusting the straps of her basket once more. "And which household on the ridge do you serve, Iris?" "The Pinerest estate," Iris said, pointing toward the dark stone silhouette that stood out against the evening sky. "I belong to the evening cleaning staff." The woman remained silent for a long moment, the steady murmur of the fountain filling the space between them as a solitary bird landed on the grass near their boots. "You had no obligation to step into that street, Iris," the woman said at last, her voice dropping to a soft whisper. "You had no reason to clean my wrist or give away your fine blue ribbon to a stranger who had nothing to offer in return." "The reasons seemed simple enough at the time," Iris said with a small shrug of her shoulders. "Your hands were shaking, the merchant was loud, and your hair was falling in your eyes. Sometimes that is enough." The elderly woman looked up, and a wide, genuine smile broke across her wrinkled face, making her gray eyes bright with an unexpected warmth. "Simple," she repeated to herself, as if the word carried a secret meaning she found deeply pleasing. Iris offered a polite curtsy, wished the woman a safe journey home, and turned back toward the main road to finish her errands, entirely unaware of the wheels that had just begun to turn. The grand study at Pinerest was a room built for a master who required absolute privacy and long hours of quiet concentration. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves carved from dark walnut lined the walls, interrupted only by a massive stone fireplace where a low fire burned throughout the year. Two tall windows looked out over the sweeping valley below, offering a clear view of the distant town lights as they began to blink awake in the early dusk. Cyrus stood by the glass, his long white hair catching the faint orange glow of the dying sunlight as he watched the iron gates at the edge of the property. His pale skin seemed almost translucent against the dark fabric of his tailored woolen coat, and his posture carried the stillness of a statue that had stood watch over the mountains for generations. He had been standing by the window for nearly 2 hours, his patience wearing thin as the shadows lengthened across the gravel driveway. His mother, the matriarch Miriam, had left the estate early that morning without an escort, a habit she refused to break despite her son's constant reminders about the unpredictable nature of the human town below. Cyrus turned his head slightly as the sound of distant carriage wheels reached his sharp ears, watching a plain hired cab pull up to the stone steps of the main entrance. Miriam stepped out of the carriage with the unhurried grace of a woman who had spent a thoroughly enjoyable afternoon and felt no need to explain her movements to anyone. Cyrus met her in the grand hall before she had even crossed the threshold, his dark eyes scanning her face for any sign of distress or exhaustion. "You were gone for the entire day without leaving a word regarding your destination," Cyrus said, his deep voice echoing slightly against the high marble ceilings of the entrance hall. "The town is changing, Mother, and it is not always wise to walk those crowded streets alone." Miriam handed her heavy wool shawl to a waiting footman and looked up at her son with an affectionate, patient smile that always managed to disarm his sternest expressions. "You have that ancient look on your face again, Cyrus," she said lightly, tapping his pale cheek with her fingers. "I am perfectly capable of navigating a human market without a guard trailing behind me. I wanted to see the valley without the formal pretense that usually follows our family name, and I had a lovely afternoon doing exactly that." Cyrus opened his mouth to reply, but his gaze was suddenly arrested by the bright flash of color at the back of her head. Tied neatly around her silver hair was a long ribbon of deep blue silk, its edges showing the unmistakable pattern of silver leaves that belonged exclusively to the domestic staff of Pinerest. "Where did you obtain that ribbon, Mother?" Cyrus asked, his voice dropping into a quiet, focused tone as he stepped closer to examine the embroidered fabric. "It was a gift from a young woman who possesses a remarkably practical mind and a very generous nature," Miriam replied, her gray eyes shining with secret amusement. "She saw that my hair was falling into my eyes after a small mishap near the fabric boutique, and she decided that I required assistance more than she required her own token of promotion. She did not know who I was, nor did she ask for anything in return for her trouble." Cyrus touched the edge of the silk, recognizing the fine work of the estate's sewing room and the light scent of mountain well water that clung to the fabric. "Who is the girl?" he asked, looking down at his mother with an expression that had shifted from frustration to genuine curiosity. "Her name is Iris, and she belongs to the evening cleaning rotation in the West Wing," Miriam said, moving toward the grand staircase with slow, measured steps. "I find myself in need of a personal daytime attendant to manage my correspondence and keep me company in the conservatory. Cyrus, I would like you to reassign her to my service, effective tomorrow morning at 7:30. Cyrus nodded slowly, watching his mother ascend the stairs before turning toward the servants' corridor to find the head housekeeper. The news of the reassignment reached the lower kitchen hall at 6 o'clock the following morning, just as the wood fires were being stoked for the breakfast preparation. Iris was standing near the large stone sink with a wooden bucket of vinegar solution when Mrs. Weaver, the head housekeeper, appeared at the top of the cellar stairs. Mrs. Weaver had managed the domestic staff at Pinerest for nearly 20 years, her movements always sharp and her expression set in a permanent mold of severe authority. She walked down the narrow aisle between the long prep tables, her keys clicking against her belt with every step she took. "Stop your work, Iris," Mrs. Weaver said, her voice clipped and entirely devoid of its usual routine indifference. "You are to leave the cleaning tubs immediately and report to the storage room to collect your formal gray uniform. The Dowager Matriarch has requested you as her personal daytime attendant, and you are expected in the greenhouse conservatory by 7:30. Do not make her wait, and ensure your apron is perfectly pressed before you present yourself." Iris stared at the older woman in silence, her hands still wet from the scrubbing water, as the other kitchen maids stopped their work to whisper among themselves. Personal service to the royal family was a position that rarely fell to someone from the lower cleaning staff, and the sudden shift felt like a stone dropping into a quiet pool. The greenhouse conservatory sat at the far eastern edge of the estate, connected to the main house by a long glass walkway lined with flowering ferns and climbing ivy. The structures were built from iron and thick glass panels that caught the early morning light, creating a warm, bright sanctuary where the mountain winter could not reach. Iris pushed open the heavy iron door at precisely 7:30, the scent of damp earth and sweet jasmine washing over her as she stepped onto the stone path. At the center of the conservatory, seated at a wrought iron table laid with a white porcelain tea service, sat the silver-haired woman from the town park. She was dressed in a fine gown of dark plum wool with delicate lace at the collar, her silver hair pinned back neatly, though the blue silk ribbon remained tied securely at the nape of her neck. Iris stopped walking, her heart beating a little faster against her ribs as she realized the true identity of the woman she had helped in the muddy street. The plain shawl and the worn shoes had been nothing more than a simple disguise, a way for the ruler's mother to walk unseen among the humans who feared her family's name. "Come inside and close the door, Iris," Miriam said with a warm smile, gesturing toward the empty iron chair across the table from her. "The morning air still carries a frost, and the orange trees do not care for the draft." Iris crossed the stone floor, paused at the proper distance, and offered a deep, formal curtsy before remaining standing. "Your Grace, I did not realize who you were yesterday," Iris said quietly, keeping her eyes lowered out of respect for the matriarch's position. "I hope my speech was not improper during our meeting in the park." "Sit down, child," "And pour the tea," Miriam said with an impatient wave of her hand. If I had wanted formal speech and trembling curtsies, I would have stayed in the drawing room with the lords of the valley. I spent the day looking for a genuine human interaction, and you gave me exactly that, without knowing you were being watched. Iris sat down carefully, her fingers steady as she lifted the porcelain teapot and filled the matriarch's cup before pouring a small amount for herself. "The blue ribbon looks very fine on you, Your Grace," Iris noted softly, watching the silver leaves catch the morning sunlight through the glass roof. "It shall stay there for the time being," Miriam declared, taking a slow sip of her tea. "It reminds me that kindness still exists without a price tag attached to it. Now, tell me about that vinegar solution you use on the West Wing baseboards, because I am convinced Mrs. Weaver has been using twice the amount necessary just to make my mornings miserable." Iris let out a small, unexpected laugh, and the tension that had filled the room vanished like mist over the mountains. Mrs. Weaver spent the remainder of the week watching Iris from the shadows of the upper corridors, her resentment growing with every day the young maid spent in the private quarters. For 20 years, the head housekeeper had controlled every detail of the domestic staff, ensuring that no human crossed the line into the family's inner circle without her personal approval. Now, a simple girl from the cleaning tubs had been elevated to a position of direct trust, bypassing every rule and hierarchy that Mrs. Weaver had spent a lifetime building. On the fourth evening of the new arrangement, after the bells had struck 9 o'clock and the lower staff had retired to their dormitory, Mrs. Weaver walked quietly toward the silver vaults, located beneath the main study. She used her master key to open the heavy oak door, her movements silent, as she stepped into the narrow room where the family's historic heirlooms were stored. Her eyes scanned the velvet-lined shelves until they settled on a small silver pocket watch, an antique piece from the late 18th century that bore the family crest engraved into its polished case. The watch had been broken for decades, its internal gears locked by time, but it remained a catalogued item of immense historic value to the estate. Mrs. Weaver wrapped the silver watch in a small square of dark cloth, slipped it into her apron pocket, and locked the vault door behind her with a soft click. She moved down the dim corridor toward the junior maid's quarters, ensuring that the hallway was clear of any lingering footmen before she pushed open the door to the empty dormitory. The room was long and cold, filled with rows of identical wooden bunks, each with a small shelf for personal items at the head of the bed. Iris's bunk was located at the far end near the window, kept in perfect, precise order, with her spare uniform folded flat and a small wooden sewing kit sitting on the shelf. Mrs. Weaver approached the bunk, lifted the brass latch of the sewing box, and placed the silver pocket watch carefully beneath the bundles of mending thread and spare buttons at the very bottom. She pressed the cloth down to hide the shape of the metal, closed the wooden lid, and left the room as silently as she had arrived, her face fixed in an expression of cold satisfaction. She told herself that she was simply restoring the proper order of the house, ensuring that an untrustworthy human could not remain close to the master's family for long. The following morning, Iris carried out her duties in the conservatory with her usual quiet efficiency, helping Miriam sort through the morning correspondence from the neighboring towns. The atmosphere between the two women had grown comfortable and light, filled with small stories about the valley's history and the old traditions of the mountain folk. Thomas, a young footman who had worked at Pinerest for 2 years, entered the glass room near midday to deliver a fresh tray of biscuits from the kitchen. He offered Iris a friendly nod as he set the tray down, his movements hurried as if he were anxious to return to his duties before the head housekeeper noticed his absence. "Mrs. Weaver has been in a terrible temper all morning," Thomas whispered to Iris, while Miriam was focused on a letter from the northern ridge. "She has been counting the silver 3 times over, and looking at everyone as though they had committed a crime." Iris thanked him for the warning, not thinking much of the housekeeper's mood, until the heavy bells of the main hall began to ring out a rare summons for a formal gathering in the master's study. The master's study was filled with the dim, cold light of the early afternoon when Iris arrived. finding Cyrus standing behind his massive dark mahogany desk with his arms folded across his chest. His white hair seemed brighter in the shadows of the room, and his pale face carried an expression of total stillness that made the air feel heavy and difficult to breathe. Mrs. Weaver stood to his right, her posture rigid and her chin lifted with an air of absolute certainty that immediately caught Iris's attention. Two senior footmen stood near the door, their expressions uncomfortable as they held Iris's small wooden sewing kit between them on a low table. Iris crossed the room, stopped before the desk, and offered a polite curtsy, her voice steady as she spoke. "You summoned me, Your Grace?" Cyrus looked down at her, his dark eyes fixed on her face with a measuring gaze that gave nothing away. "Mrs. Weaver has brought a very serious charge against you, Iris," he said, his deep voice calm and measured. "She claims that you have abused your new position of trust within this household. Your Grace, I discovered this antique silver pocket watch hidden at the bottom of Iris's personal sewing box during my morning inspection of the quarters," Mrs. Weaver said, stepping forward and lifting the silver watch from the velvet cloth. "This piece has belonged to your family since the 1790s, and it has no business being inside a maid's dormitory unless it was taken with dishonest intent." Iris looked at the silver watch, recognizing the intricate engravings of the family crest, before looking directly into the housekeeper's cold eyes. "I have never seen that watch before this moment, Mrs. Weaver," Iris said clearly, her voice rising without a hint of fear or hesitation. "I have no need for silver, and I have never entered the vaults beneath the study. The sewing box is kept on an open shelf, where anyone in the dormitory could have placed it while I was attending the matriarch." "An expected denial, Your Grace," Mrs. Weaver said with a heavy sigh, turning back toward Cyrus. "A girl from the cleaning tubs cannot be expected to resist the temptation of such fine things when she is suddenly given access to the private rooms. I request that she be dismissed from the estate immediately without a reference." Cyrus did not reply immediately, instead reaching out with his long, pale fingers to take the silver watch from the housekeeper's hand. He turned the antique piece over twice, his thumb tracing the worn lines of the engraving, before he brought the watch closer to his face to examine the crown at the top. The room was completely silent, except for the crackle of the low fire in the hearth, as everyone waited for the master's judgment. "This watch has been broken for more than 30 years, Cyrus said softly, his voice echoing in the quiet room as he looked up at Mrs. Weaver. "The internal gears were rusted tight long before I took over the management of Pinerest, and the winding mechanism has remained frozen." He held the watch out toward the light from the window, his thumb pressing against the small metal crown. "However, the resistance on this crown is tight, meaning someone has attempted to wind it within the past 24 hours, likely out of habit while handling the piece. A thief who intended to steal silver would have no reason to try and wind a broken watch, nor would they handle it with such careless familiarity before hiding it away. Someone else held this watch recently, someone who spent enough time with it to turn the crown without thinking." He looked directly into the housekeeper's eyes, and Mrs. Weaver's pale face went entirely still. "We shall check the vault access logs this evening to see who last signed for item 47, Cyrus added quietly. "The footman may return the sewing kit to the dormitory. Iris, you will remain here. We have further matters to discuss regarding the household records." The library of Pinerest was a vast, silent chamber located on the ground floor of the north wing, its high windows looking out over the wild timber paths that led into the deeper mountains. It was a room filled with the scent of old paper, leather bindings, and beeswax, preserved by generations of masters who valued knowledge above all else. Cyrus had given Iris full access to the administrative cabinet near the fireplace, providing her with a written note of authorization that allowed her to examine the estate's financial ledgers dating back 4 years. Thomas, the young footman, held a tall oil lamp steadily beside her as she turned the heavy pages of the quarterly accounts, her fingers tracing the neat columns of figures written in standard clerk script. Iris had spent the last 3 hours cross-referencing the household expenses against the receipts from the local town merchants, looking for the small discrepancies that Cyrus suspected had been hidden beneath the surface for some time. The Pinerest estate maintained 2 large charitable funds, one to provide a small winter allowance for retired human servants, and another to purchase coal and flour for the poorer families in the valley below. As the night deepened, Iris found the first inconsistency in the records from 3 years ago, where a regular disbursement of $45 for the retired staff fund did not match the individual signatures of the recipients listed in the back of the book. The total paid out to the elderly servants came to only $32, leaving $13 entered under a single line marked as administrative costs, with no further explanation. She turned the pages quickly, finding the same compressed handwriting appearing every quarter, always reducing the amount of aid sent to the town while increasing the hidden fees. The handwriting did not belong to the estate clerk, but matched the sharp, slanted script that Mrs. Weaver used on the daily duty rosters and supply requests hung in the kitchen hall. Iris reached into the back of the cabinet, her fingers brushing against a small, dark green ledger that had been tucked behind a stack of old supplier contracts where it would not be easily found during a routine check. She pulled it out, opened the cover, and found a detailed personal record of the actual amounts paid out to the merchants, alongside a column showing the exact sums that the housekeeper had kept for herself over the past 4 years. The total at the bottom of the final page was large enough to have purchased a small house in the center of the town square, taken directly from the food and warmth promised to the people who depended on the estate's kindness. Iris closed the green ledger with a firm click, her face set in an expression of quiet determination as she looked up at the young footman beside her. "Thomas, go to the master's study and tell his grace that I have found the second set of books," Iris said, her voice calm but filled with an undeniable authority. "Tell him we have everything we need to set things right for the town." The footman nodded quickly, setting the oil lamp down on the long reading table before hurrying out the door into the dark corridor. Iris sat alone in the warm circle of lamplight, looking at the evidence of 4 years of slow, silent greed, and felt a deep sense of relief that the truth had finally caught up with the shadows. She knew that the next hour would change the structure of the household forever, but she felt entirely grounded and ready for whatever the morning would bring. The small dining room at Pinerest was reserved for intimate family gatherings, its walls paneled in dark oak, and its long table set tonight for only 6 people. Cyrus sat at the head of the table, his white hair reflecting the soft candlelight as he looked down the length of the cloth at the senior members of his staff who had been asked to attend the evening meal. Miriam sat to his right, her gray eyes calm and watchful as she rested her hands on the table, the blue silk ribbon still visible in her hair. Mrs. Weaver sat near the foot of the table, her posture stiffer than usual, and her face completely devoid of color as she stared at the empty porcelain plate before her. The butler and the estate steward occupied the remaining seats, their movements hesitant, as if they sensed the cold current running beneath the quiet surface of the room. Iris stood quietly near the sideboard at the far end of the chamber, her hands folded over her gray apron as she maintained the watchful stance of a trusted personal attendant. When the final plates were cleared away by the kitchen staff, Cyrus set down his glass and looked directly at the head housekeeper, his dark eyes fixed on her face with a level intensity that made the air in the room turn cold. "I have completed my review of the household charitable funds this evening," Cyrus said, his deep voice carrying a quiet force that caused the butler to look away. "The records show that a substantial portion of the money intended for the retired staff and the Valley families has been diverted over the past 4 years. The discrepancies are detailed in a small green ledger discovered in the library cabinet, written entirely in a hand that matches the vault signature logs." Mrs. Weaver did not look up from her plate, her fingers gripping the edge of the white tablecloth until her knuckles turned as white as the master's hair. "Your service to this family is finished, Mrs. Weaver," Cyrus continued, his tone calm and unyielding. "You will have until the morning light to gather your personal belongings and leave the ridge." No reference will be provided, and the town council will be informed of the correct figures regarding the merchant accounts. The housekeeper stood up slowly, pushing her heavy wooden chair back with a scraping sound that echoed loudly against the paneled walls, before walking out of the room without uttering a single word of defense or apology. The heavy door closed behind her, and the lingering tension in the room seemed to lift like fog after a heavy rain. Miriam turned her head toward the sideboard and offered Iris a warm, bright smile that reached all the way to her gray eyes. "Iris, come forward and stand by the table," the matriarch said gently. The young maid crossed the room with steady steps, stopping beside Miriam's chair, with her head held high and her hands composed. "My son and I have discussed the future management of this house," Miriam announced, looking at the remaining senior staff members. "The position of housemistress has remained empty for too long, and we require someone who possesses both the practical intelligence to manage the accounts and the genuine honesty to look after our people. We are offering the keys to you, Iris." Cyrus nodded in agreement, a faint, rare smile touching his pale lips as he looked up at the girl who had changed his mother's journey in the town market. "The funds for the valley will be restored tomorrow morning, Iris, and your first duty will be to ensure the winter wood is delivered to the retired servants before the first snow falls." Iris looked at the blue ribbon in the matriarch's silver hair, then at the master, whose dark eyes held a newfound respect that felt far more valuable than any silver coin. "I accept the position, Your Grace," Iris said clearly, her voice steady and true. "We shall begin the winter count first thing in the morning." The first winter snow had just begun to drift past the tall glass windows of the conservatory, dusting the dark mountain ridges in a clean, quiet blanket of white. Iris stood by the iron table, holding a fresh ledger filled with the newly balanced accounts of the Valley charity funds, her fingers tracing the neat columns that now represented real warmth and food for the people below. The keys of the estate hung from her belt with a soft, comforting chime that marked her steady movement through the grand corridors she had once cleaned with a heavy wooden bucket. Over the past months, the heavy shadows of Pinerest had begun to feel less like a boundary between two separate worlds, and more like a shared shelter, where humans and the hidden rulers could live in quiet harmony. She looked out over the valley lights as they began to blink awake through the falling snow, thinking of the journey that had started with nothing more than a ruined bolt of blue silk in a muddy street. It was a strange, beautiful thing to realize how quickly a life could change when a person chose to look at a stranger's trouble and see a simple reason to help without expecting a return. Cyrus stepped into the room from the glass walkway, his white hair catching the soft evening lamplight as he crossed the stone floor to stand beside her at the window. He did not speak immediately, his quiet presence carrying a warmth that Iris had learned to recognize beneath his pale skin and silent movements. They stood together in the quiet sanctuary of the glass room, watching the snow cover the mountain trails, both of them looking toward a future built on trust, respect, and the simple kindness that had brought them out of the dark.